How do you get a 9-year-old boy to tuck in his dress shirt at church? This was a question that frustrated my mother to no end. She had 6 children, and it was important to her that we looked respectful in church. And I was the 9-year-old ragamuffin boy who had no intention of changing my behavior. I would, out of respect, tuck it in if she was watching me, but other than that, it just wasn't important to me. But I had a problem because my mom was very creative, and she came up with a solution where she knew, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that I would have my shirt tucked in at all times. It wouldn't matter if she was observing me. It wouldn't matter if I was hanging around with my ragamuffin cousins and friends, and they all had their shirts untucked. She knew I was going to comply. So how did she do that? So my mother was a seamstress. She would make wedding dresses, and she had all this extra lace from these wedding dresses. And she said, "Nathan, if you don't keep your shirt tucked in, I'm going to sew lace around the bottom of all your shirts." And so was that an effective solution? Absolutely. So she never had to do it because the warning was good enough. I got the point. I changed my behavior. But why I share that is because a lot of you in your organizations have little Nathans running around. They could be employees, they could be supervisors, they could be leaders who are not showing the right behaviors because it's just not important to them. And I will tell you, there are ways to sew lace around the bottom of their shirts where all of a sudden they start to pay attention. And I've seen it time and time again throughout organizations. Why is that important? Gallup does a poll every year, and this year, at an all-time high, they show that 33% of employees are engaged. So that means 67% of employees are not engaged. That means they're either checked out or they're actively disengaged, where they're actually working against what you're trying to accomplish. So if your strategy doesn't address the disengaged employees, you're going to have a problem. And so I'm going to talk about that because I've worked with a lot of companies that have had those problems. So my experience in working with hundreds of companies is this. We all know that culture drives behaviors, and behaviors influence culture, right? Foundational to that, there are 3 things that if you don't have these 3 things as a foundation to your company, you're going to have problems. And these are also the culture killers. If these things are lacking, they're culture killers. And I'm going to go through all 3 of these, but the first one is commitment. The second one is clarity. And the third one is consistency. So the first one, commitment. If you think about an owner or a leader of an organization and why they might have, why safety might be important to them, it's either going to be because of internal motivators, such as, I care about my employees, I want them to go home at night, it's just important to me as a person. That's what I would call an internal motivator. They also have external motivators. That could be OSHA. It could be our incident rate's too high and the board is asking questions and they want answers on what you're doing about it. It could be your workers' compensation costs are out of control. It could be a lot of things, but those are external motivators. And those 2 things work in combination set the tone for everybody. What we have to recognize is at all levels of our organization, we have both those internal and external motivators. And sometimes they're lacking. So if you take an external motivator at a senior leadership level, like workers' compensation, for example, as you move down the chain, that becomes diluted. And so if you don't have other external motivators in place to influence behaviors, it can lead to issues. The second one is clarity. Employees need to know precisely what you expect out of them. What, as an organization, as leaders of an organization, what are our expectations? If you're a construction company, what are the non-negotiables? Where it doesn't matter who in your organization violates that non-negotiable, there's going to be a problem, right? You have to draw the line in the sand where, for example, we say not wearing fall protection is simply not allowed in our company. It's not going to happen, okay? And then you need clarity around what are the consequences if that does happen. Every employee should know what are the consequences if I am observed not wearing fall protection and working from heights. Every employee should know that. And then clarity around performance. And we'll get into that, but how do we keep it in front of folks how they're doing in relation to our expectations? The third one is consistency. Here is an absolute culture killer. If you have inconsistency between supervisors, departments, shifts, locations, and a lot of companies have struggles here, it kills your culture. Because your culture is rooted in what we kind of believe as an organization, what we practice as an organization. So I'm going to take you through 3 different examples, company examples of what I would call troubled companies who have absolutely made turnarounds, where they're dramatic turnarounds. In all these examples, I will tell you that within your organizations, you have the engaged employees who have great ideas, and you need to get those ideas out. They also are the ones that can tell you, is this solution the equivalent of sewing lace on the bottom of a shirt? Is it going to make somebody who is not in conformity come in line? They know, because they know your culture, right? So the first example is a general contractor. About 15 years ago, I was asked to meet with a leadership team. I came to their boardroom. All the leaders of the organization were sitting around, and they had a problem. They had just had their 3rd fatality in 5 years. Not one incident where 3 people died, but 3 different incidents that resulted in fatalities. And they said, what are we doing wrong? They said, we have a full-time safety professional, and they only had roughly 150 employees. We're doing all the required safety training, and we provide them with all the safety equipment. But we just had a young man who, while working with 5 other employees from heights, walked out onto a steel beam in observation. The other 5 employees were watching him do this, and he fell to his death. They said, how does that happen? And I said, well, clearly your culture makes it okay for someone not to wear fall protection from heights, because you had 5 employees watch that happen and not say anything. And they said, well, we were talking about that. We're wondering, should we write up and discipline those 5 employees? They let him fall to his death. So the question was, should we discipline these 5 employees? I said, I'm going to ask you a question, all of you a question, and you have to give me a truthful answer. If any one of you had driven out to that site the day that it occurred, and you observed an employee walking out without fall protection, return safely, no incident, what would you have done? They all kind of looked at each other. And a young man at the other end of the table, who is now the president of the company, said, gentlemen, I think what he's trying to tell us is the problem isn't the employees, it's us. The leadership of that company had not clearly set the tone of what the expectations were for that company. So today, this same company is a best-in-class performer. They win safety awards. They're very different today. I can tell you 3 fatalities did not change that company, unfortunately. What changed the company overnight was when we rolled out new accountability measures, and the first person to violate the safety non-negotiables was the best superintendent that they had, the one that got the most projects done the quickest. And he got 3 days off without pay. That company changed overnight because now the employees knew they're serious. The insight here that I want you to take away is you cannot simply enforce safety rules when there's an incident. Too many companies do that. If you have written people up or given people progressive discipline for incidents, you should have 3 to 5 write-ups for behaviors for every one of those, where you observed a behavior and you held somebody accountable for that unsafe behavior of a non-negotiable. If you have that thing out of balance, You are not operating a fair operation. It's not fair to your employees. You're not consistent and you're not clear. Another example is a transportation company. I show this example. I know a lot of you folks are construction, but here's an area where I think a lot of construction companies today fall short. Transportation is a big part of your risk, your fleet. It's where serious injuries can happen. But this is a transportation company. They had a problem. Their problem was the DOT had flagged them for giving them 2 alerts. And this is public information. So somebody can go on and look at a transportation company and say, these guys have unsafe drivers. That means they're speeding, they're getting in accidents, all these things. And they had hours of service issues, which meant they're driving over hours, they're falsifying logs, that type of thing. And they wanted our help. And we sat down and they said, our problem is, if we try to hold these guys accountable, they'll just leave. A driver can leave us today and have a job tomorrow. And so if we try to put the squeeze on them, it's just not going to work. So we got creative. We recognize that with a driver, there's a lot of things that they're expected to do. Operationally, they got to get the product there on time. Safety-wise, you're not supposed to speed, you're not supposed to have hard braking events, you're not supposed to have accidents. Fuel, we want you to be fuel efficient, all these different things. But oftentimes there's not clarity for the driver. It's either safety loves me and operations loves me not, or operations loves me and safety loves me not. So we said, we're going to put together a driver scorecard where we show clearly for every driver that if what we expected them. And the way we came up with this is we asked the leaders and said, if you could drive every truck personally, what would that look like? What's the most important? Is it fuel economy? Is it driving safely? Is it getting there on time? And so we looked at all these metrics and we created an algorithm which boiled down to 1 score for every driver. And from that score, we could show the drivers where they stacked up in the company. You're either our best driver or the top 10, or this is a fleet of about 100 trucks. This is just an example graph up here. What this did is it showed if you ask anybody that runs a trucking company, who are your top 10 drivers and who are your bottom 10 drivers, it's going to change depending on who you ask. Safety will tell you one thing. The dispatchers will tell you another thing. But the point here, we have absolute clarity. So the drivers know what the expectations are. What were the results? This company, the 2 years before we implemented this, the 2 bars on the left are the violation points from the DOT. So this is where they get speeding tickets. This is where they get in accidents. We're 2 weeks away from completing a full year with this new system in place. They've had 17 violation points. They no longer have an unsafe alert on their DOT score. And that impacts insurance costs, and impacts their ability to get jobs, all those things. It's impactful to their business. The insight I'd like you to take away here is transparency around performance is absolutely vital. And that's at every level of the organization. Leaders of your organization, employees of your organization need to know how they're performing against your expectations. My last example is a mechanical contractor. This is one of those companies where the president of the company is absolutely committed to safety, no doubt about it, no question in my mind. I knew this guy was all in, and we met with them back in 2009. We told them about how we could help them because he said, we have to do something about this. We're having injury rates that are 2 and 3 times worse than our industry average. And we had a good discussion. He said, I like what you're talking about. He says, but we've just partnered with a consultant and we're going to give them 3 years to get us turned around. I said, okay, you're a very patient person, but we'll come back in 3 years. So we came back in 3 years. And they were quick, the leadership team was quick to tell us all the things that they had put in place. New safety training, new safety programs, all this stuff. And we said, well, what about the results? What do the numbers look like? That wasn't as good of a story. Their injury rates had actually gotten worse. And we said, don't confuse activity with results. So this company, what was clear, the leadership was committed. They were all in. But when you started to move down the chain, that leadership, the commitment started to lack. There wasn't enough external motivators. They weren't holding people accountable in the organization is the bottom line. And so we put together a new program that included accountability. And we had a discussion about how if we get this right, it's going to be disruptive. It's going to be like lace on the bottom of the shirt where people say, whoa, okay, they're serious now, okay? And so the insight here is accountability strengthens downstream commitment. And it's not that the leaders below the president didn't care about safety. It's not that at all. But you got to recognize everybody has external motivators that will promote safety, and they have external motivators like I got to get the job done that might work against us. So you got to bring balance to that. So we we're rolling out the new program. We got all the employees, a couple hundred employees into a rented space. And the president and I had a discussion beforehand, and we went over this and said, this has to be disruptive. These people have seen so many new programs roll out. This cannot look like flavor of the month. So the message is going to be disruptive, and it's by design. And so we laid it out there. We rolled out the new program, and the president says, are there any questions? And a gentleman, mind you, this is 3 years after they'd been working on their safety. An employee raises his hand and says, if I hear what I think I'm hearing, if I continue to do my job the same way for this client, or if I do this particular job the way you're telling me I'll have to do it for this particular client, we're going to get fired. And the president said, well, why is that? He says, well, it's going to take me a lot longer. And the president said, I'm so glad you asked that. He says, if you continue to do it the way you've been doing it, you will not work here. He says, if we have clients doing business with us because we're unsafe, we will get new clients. Any more questions? There were no more questions. It was pretty clear what the new tone of the company was. So let's look at them 5 years later. This is how they've performed since that period of time. It changed overnight. The employees simply needed clarity, and they want consistency. You ask a subcontractor employee, tell me which of the general contractors you have a lot of respect for their safety program. And they'll rattle them off. And you say, well, why is that? And they'll say, because they're absolutely clear from the beginning of the job to the end of the job what the expectations are. Secondly, they are consistent. It doesn't matter which sub you are. If it's one of their employees, one of our employees, they treat everybody the same as it relates to safety. It's powerful. Engaged employees expect it. Engaged employees want to see the disengaged employees held accountable. The insight here is, if you want dramatic improvement, if you need to have a strong shift in your company, the solution needs to be disruptive. And that's okay. And you'll get disruptive results. So what's the call to action? We can't have 67% of our employees disengaged when it comes to safety. And so as leaders in safety, you have to figure out what's the lace in our organization. What do we need to put in place to change behaviors? Because we need 100% engagement when it comes to safety. Thank you.